Thank you all so much for joining us today, and welcome to our Abney YP policy brief on mail-in voting. We are lucky to have the opportunity to hear from not one, but two wonderful speakers today, Rachel Bloom, Policy Director at Citizens Union, and Wayne Bena, Deputy Secretary of State for Elections at the Office of Nebraska Secretary of State. Rachel Bloom is the Policy Director for Citizens Union. Her work focuses on New York State policy, with particular attention paid to access to voting and policing. Focusing on these issues, she works with Citizen Union members as well as with national partners to advance good government reform. Ms. Bloom is a proud alumna of Barnard College and received her master's degree in social policy and planning from the London School of Economics. Ms. Bloom will present on mail-in voting in New York, specifically what policies are in place now, lessons learned from recent primaries, and what we can expect for the November general election. Wayne Bena was named Nebraska's Deputy Secretary of State for Elections in September 2017. Prior to accepting this role, he served as Election Commissioner of Sarpy County for 8 years, giving him a unique view of elections from both the county and state perspectives. Among his accomplishments he has made in a short time as the Deputy Secretary of State was collaborating with Omaha-based election systems and software and the Center for Internet Security to achieve the installation of the Albert sensor, a device to protect the state's voter registration system. This national award-winning project has since been copied in 7 other states. Wayne holds a bachelor's degree in political science and law and a law degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. He served as a board member on both the Sarpy County Chamber of Commerce and the Sarpy County Sports Commission. Wayne and his wife Jill live in Papillion, Nebraska. Mr. Bena will discuss Nebraska as a case study for mail-in voting, clarifying how it operates, what worked and what didn't, and how we can apply those practices more broadly. Following the presentations, we will address audience questions, so please submit your questions via the Q&A function throughout. Thank you all so much for joining us again, and we hope that you can get the word out about Abney YP using @ABetterNY. And please sign up, if you have the time, sign up to be a poll worker. We really need them in New York, and we hope that you can do it and encourage you to do so. We will put the link in the chat for you to sign up. I will now pass the screen to Ms. Bloom for her presentation, and following that, we will have Mr. Bena's presentation. Thank you all again for joining us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Bloom. I'm just waiting for my slideshow to go up live. There. Excellent. There we go. My name is Rachel Bloom. As Sarah said, I'm the Public Policy Director at Citizens Union. I'm really excited to be here today to talk with you about our elections here in New York and how we're going to be approaching this coming November election, where many of us will be voting by mail. We can go to the next slide, please. That's Citizens Union mission statement. I don't need to read it to you. That's the beauty of a PowerPoint slide. But just to tell you a little bit more about our work, we have been working on election reform and voting, among many other issues, at Citizens Union for decades. When in the last 2 years, we've had, as you may have heard, a lot of legislative victories in New York. We've finally got past early voting. We passed registration portability. So if you move within the state, your voter registration moves with you. We've passed things like pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds and electronic poll books, which make early voting and election day run more smoothly. More recently, in the last several months, we've been very actively engaged in working to ensure that all eligible New Yorkers are able to safely cast a ballot that will be counted this November. And that looks like a lot of different things lately. It's been lobbying in Albany for legislative reform, testifying at oversight hearings, working with the Board of Elections, and engaging in critical public education efforts. This election, as we all can imagine, is unlike any we've ever seen. I always say that if we had a storm or if we had, if there was a hurricane, we could look to many other states to see what had worked in the past. But when it comes to COVID, we're all sort of operating without a blueprint and figuring it out as we proceed. So next slide, please. So when I was asked to talk on this panel, I said, okay, I would absolutely love to, love Abney. But in New York, we technically, vote by mail versus absentee voting. You hear both of them. What does it mean? What's the difference? So we don't have vote by mail. So some states have vote by mail, where everyone registered in that state automatically gets sent a ballot. You fill it out and you drop it off either at a drop box or in a mailbox. And that's how people in several states, not that many, but a growing number of states vote. That's not how we operate in New York. So you might have heard how in New Jersey, they're just sending a ballot to everyone. We're not able to do that because we are limited by the New York State Constitution. In New York State, you have to actually actively request an absentee ballot. They can't just mail it to everyone. In the June primary, you probably heard how the governor, he mailed everyone an application for an absentee ballot, but he didn't just send everyone a ballot that they could fill out. And one of the things that New York, New York has every state I'm sure has this, but in New York, we have a lot of things that make us special, special or more complicated, depending on how you look at it. And one of them is that we don't have something called no excuse absentee voting. So what that means in most states, if you want to vote absentee, you could just request it. But in New York, you have to, it has to be you are either out of the state or you are sick. There are very specific reasons, and that is enshrined in the Constitution, which is why we had to, for the June primary, the governor signed an executive order that expanded the definition of an illness, which allowed you to select, temporary illness or physical disability to be inclusive of the fear of acquiring COVID. So, that required an executive order by the governor, and it actually has now been signed. A bill was passed and just signed into law last week that is now become a state law, and it'll be in place until the end of 2021. The reason that had to happen is because the executive order that the governor signed, it was only valid for the primary. He would have either had to reissue an executive order for the general election in November, or a law has been passed, and a law was passed. The reason that the law that was passed last week, it extends through 2021 is because one of the reforms that we've passed in New York was no excuse absentee ballots. So when I said we've passed a lot of reforms, we have, but some of the reforms require us to amend our state constitution. And to amend a state constitution, the bill has to pass twice in two different elected legislative bodies, and then it has to go to the voters have to vote on it. So hopefully by the time the bill runs out at the end of 2021, we will have passed no excuse absentee voting statewide, and someone can request an absentee ballot for whatever reason they so desire. So that's a little bit about what's vote by mail, where anyone can do it and it doesn't need any request. It can automatically be processed by the state versus New York, where there are constitutionally mandated reasons that you can request an absentee ballot. And we had to change the law in order to make it fear of acquiring COVID was a reason that you could request an absentee ballot. Next slide, please. So the next thing I want to talk about is the lessons learned in the June primary. As I said, we didn't have, there was no blueprint to look to another state. I mean, a state that had voted, a month or two before, but there was no established pattern. There was no established practice of how we run an election in a pandemic. So some of the things that we did learn in June that are going to carry us into November, and I think are also just lessons that we're going to be incorporating into some of our elections moving forward, COVID or no COVID. The first thing is that there was a huge demand for absentee ballots. I'm sure this comes as no surprise to any of you. But when I heard the Board of Elections come out with some of the data about, sort of the shift, it was remarkable. So New York has historically had one of the lowest absentee voting rates in the country, among the 5 lowest. And so for the 2016 primary, they processed a little over 64,000 absentee ballot applications. In 2020 in the primary, they processed 775,000 absentee ballot requests. So that's an increase of 12 times, and it happened in an 8-week period. And when you think about that, I think people criticize the Board of Elections a lot. I have criticized the Board of Elections a lot, but I also think that we have to be really mindful of what they are being asked to deal with, the time frame in which they are being asked to make all of these changes, and the circumstances under which they're doing it. The Board of Elections was hit by COVID. Many of their staffers were ill. A few of them died. They were dealing with having to source materials. There's certain things just like making sure that you get enough envelopes and that you get enough ballots. And a lot of this is mandated by how it has to look and how it has to be printed and how it has to be designed. And there's not a lot of room for them to sort of do whatever they want, and it has to come from certain manufacturers. And so these are things that they'd be hard enough to upscale, to increase your rates, and in such a short period of time, you add COVID to it, it becomes an even more complicated process. One of the things that we did do in the June primary, the Board of Elections, I'm not the Board of Elections, did do, and which is continuing for the November general, is that they also created an online portal where you can request your absentee ballot. That had never existed in New York up until a few months ago. You always had to print out a paper ballot and mail it in. So the fact that they moved it online was tremendous. It made it much more accessible. And 54% of their applications that they received did come in from the online portal. So then let's go to a few other things. Postmark issues, which I'm sure everyone heard about, that one of the things that the governor signed was an executive order paying for the postage of all your primary absentee ballots. So when you sent your ballot back, you didn't have to worry about postage. The problem is that since it was prepaid, it meant that they didn't automatically necessarily get postmarked. And so some ballots were thrown out because they didn't have postmarks, and they were received past Election Day and they didn't have postmarks. That especially was a problem with the mailing and the receiving of the ballots in Brooklyn. They said that in the other 4 counties, they didn't really have a big problem with the mail, but in Brooklyn, it's a little bit hard to assess where the fault was, but the BOE said they weren't really surprised that they had mailing issues in Brooklyn, but so they did. Another thing that we heard about was some issues with the ballots. So there's a very strict policy of how you want for your absentee ballot to be counted. The envelope that you have to fill out and sign has to be filled out a certain way, and it has to be sealed a certain way. If you seal it with tape, it can be thrown out. If you seal it with glue, it can be thrown out. And so a lot of ballots were thrown out and are thrown out all the time. The percentage of absentee ballots thrown out was keeping with past rates. So in 2016, 21% of absentee ballots were thrown out. 23% of ballots were thrown out in 2020. But when you think about the difference in the numbers from 64,000 to 775,000, it's a much larger number of ballots that were being thrown out. Another thing that they had to do is every absentee ballot that comes into the Board of Elections, they had to copy both sides of it. In any instance where a ballot was being contested or it was a close race, there was a recount, they copied over 443,000 absentee ballots for challenges in court cases, and they had to photocopy both sides. So that's another thing when you think of what the Board of Election had to deal with in the June primary. They've ordered new sorting machines that will be able to open, date, and PDF the front and back of all absentee ballots for the November general election, which is going to be a huge improvement. And I talked a little bit about the capacity of the Board of Elections. I talked a little bit about the supply chain issues. But the last thing was the counting of the ballots. You know, we did not know who won certain elections for weeks until after the elections. So we don't count absentee ballots until after Election Day. We don't start counting them as they come in. We count them after Election Day. And because so many people were voting absentee, it just took a very long time to process. And I think the thing that this is a lesson that is a lesson for, it's a lesson for us now, and it's a lesson as we move forward, is that we need to accept that we're not going to be getting results on election night anymore. Next, as we move forward, we're going to be dealing with ranked choice voting in New York in the next municipal election in 2021. And I think that, you know, we're used to automatically knowing who won an election, and I think that that's just something that we're going to have to get used to not being the case anymore. So that's some of what we learned in June. Next slide, please. So here's a list of some of the reforms we've implemented for the November election. As I mentioned, a bill was just passed allowing no excuse absentee voting, or allowing COVID and fear of acquiring COVID to be a reason. So everyone can request an absentee ballot. You can now request an absentee ballot online. Again, that had to be a bill that was passed. I know you're probably thinking to yourself, like, God, why does all of this require legislation? I could go into a long story about that, but it does. And also this means that now it'll be sort of set throughout the state of New York. It's not going to be one county has online and another county doesn't have it online. Now all counties will have it online. One of the things that passed, which will make, I think, help with the Board of Elections, and this is something that they requested, you could only request an absentee ballot 30 days before the election, which was really hard when they were getting so many more people requesting absentee ballots, and it made it hard for them to plan. A bill was passed allowing people to request a ballot earlier than just 30 days. Ballot postmark. So now if your ballot was received a day after Election Day without a postmark, it will be counted. And if it was received up to a week after Election Day with a postmark before or on Election Day, it will be counted. Ability to cure a ballot. So curing a ballot is an interesting term. That's for all those people, that 23% of absentee ballots that were thrown out. That is, you know, they'll be able to, the Board of Elections can reach out to you and contact you, and you can clarify what you meant. So if your signature, if you signed your envelope in the wrong place, or if you taped your envelope shut instead of licking it with, you know, your mouth, then you can cure your ballot. It gives you an opportunity for the Board of Elections to reach out to you, and you can go and fix it. I mentioned the machinery to process absentee ballots. That was not a legislative fix. That was something being done by just the Board of Elections here in New York City. Not all boards of elections are going to be doing that. And ballot drop boxes is another reform that is being implemented by the New York City Board of Elections. As you've heard, the president, there's a lot of concern about whether or not an envelope dropped in the mail will get to the Board of Elections in time to be counted. So one of the things that they have done, the New York City Board of Elections is setting up, is that every poll site, every early voting site, every Election Day poll site, there will be a ballot drop box at the check-in table. So you can just walk in and you can drop off your ballot. You could drop it off for anyone you want, your parents, your partner, your roommates. You can just drop it off as long as it's signed in advance. Next slide, please. So those are all the things that we've already done for the November election, which is a lot. But then there are a few things that haven't been done yet. We don't know if the Board of Elections is going to be paying for postage for when you mail your absentee ballot back. It doesn't right now, it doesn't, it's an oversized envelope. It is going to cost, 2 to 3 first class stamps. And it's a little bit of a poll tax, especially if you don't have a stamp at home and you have to go out and get that. So online voter registration, New York State has passed online voter registration. It will go into effect statewide in 2021. And right now you can only register to vote online if you have a New York State driver's license or photo ID. We were trying to pass online voter registration for New York City because New York City created a process and then it wasn't allowed to make their website go live because of the state law that was passed. We were trying to get a little amendment passed. So just for this coming election right now, voter registrations has dropped off precipitously in New York City, especially compared to 2016. We're getting about half the amount of people registering to vote that we normally see in a presidential election year. And that just doesn't seem like it's going to be happening in time for the November election. Ballot drop boxes, I talked about New York City, but that's because the New York City Board of Elections is doing that of their own volition. They're not being mandated to do it. So we would love to see ballot drop boxes all across the state. And a bill has been introduced to do so, but it's unclear when the state legislature might be back in session to, be able to pass such a law. And finally, funding. New York State, every county has to pay and fund their elections. And all of this costs a lot of money. And we are very lucky that in New York City, the Board of Elections doesn't so much have to worry about not being able to, cover the costs of sending out 775,000 absentee ballots. But in other counties and smaller counties throughout the state, it is a real financial hardship. Next slide. So there's lots of ways to vote. I'm going to hurry up and run through these next one. You can vote absentee. You can mail it in. You could drop it off the Board of Elections. You could drop it at a poll site. Early voting. We're going to have 10 days of early voting. We strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to vote early. The poll sites will be empty. You'll have lots of time, lots of space. That's really sort of what a lot of people are encouraging people to go out and vote early. And of course, we'll have poll sites on election day. The polls are open from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. So you can go anytime on election day. One thing that is unusual about New York is even if you've requested, received, or returned an absentee ballot, you can still vote in person early or on election day, and only the in-person vote will be counted. And final slide. These are some of the deadlines. Maybe Sarah can send them out, but when I'm done talking. But they're deadlines for when you have to register, request your absentee ballot, and mail it in. And this is all of that information in one space. The last thing I'm going to say before I hang up is Sarah mentioned at the beginning, the one thing that, they are really asking New Yorkers right now who are able to and want to is to sign up to be a poll worker. A lot of our poll workers aren't able to go out because they just don't feel safe doing so. And if you do feel safe doing so, they would love to hire you for the day to be a poll worker or for election day and all 10 days of early voting. You get paid if you work all of the days of early voting and election day. You can make up to $2,800. So sign up your friends, and we'll hope to see you as a poll worker. And I guess the number one thing is there's lots of ways to vote. We have lots of options, more options than we've ever had before. The most important thing is that you go out and you vote however you choose to cast your ballot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was so great. And I'll make sure to pass along all those very important deadlines. Now I'll pass it off to Wayne Bena, who will speak about their experiences in Nebraska with mail-in voting and what that looked like. Take it away. Thank you.
All right. Sarah, can everyone see my screen?
Yeah, perfect.
All right, great. Well, thanks everyone for having me. I want to shout out to Nicole Weingartner, a very good friend of mine, for connecting me with your organization, and I'm glad to join you. I was just in Albany actually last year, around the June timeframe. In my introduction, we talked a little bit about an Albert Monitor, and it's the nonprofit that works with Homeland Security to provide us election security. So there is a good connection to election security in Albany, New York. So great to be with you today. Been asked to talk a little bit about the Nebraska experience. Voting by mail is nothing new to Nebraskans, but we saw it on steroids for our primary election. And so I wanted to share the Nebraska experience as New York starts to look at, as we've seen, as we was just described, how early voting and by mail voting has increased. What different laws can be looked at just from the administration perspective, how you can get results earlier, how you can have a better voting experience when more people are deciding to vote early. So a little bit about Nebraska. We have approximately 1.2 million registered voters. We have 93 counties, which is a lot for a state our size. I know from what I understand, New York has approximately 62 counties, I believe. And elections are run at the county level. And so our largest county is Douglas County, which is Omaha, Nebraska, for those of you who are familiar with Omaha. And they have approximately 360,000 registered voters. Our smallest county is Arthur County, and they have 331 voters. But it's in a large area of the county, so it's interesting, the dynamic of just our smallest and our largest, just how many counties that we have in the state. And finally, we have 11 counties of our 93 that vote exclusively by mail. We have a law that if your county has 10,000 or less in population, then you can apply to the Secretary of State's office to have one or all of your precincts vote completely by mail, mainly because you might have not have the ability to have an ADA accessible polling site, or you have a hard time finding poll workers, or poll workers of a particular party. So there's many different reasons why you would want to do that. And starting, while we had many different precincts across the state, it wasn't until the primary of 2018 that the first full county was allowed in Nebraska. And by now in the general election of 2020, we have 11 counties that will be going completely by mail. So a little bit about the Nebraska experience. So the Nebraska primary was held on May 12th, 2020, which was the statutorily required date. A postponement wasn't asked for, wasn't granted, and from the start of the pandemic, the message was the election would occur on May 12th. And so I will take you to the end, and then we'll start back at the beginning to let you know how we went about doing it. So approximately 493,000 people voted in that election, breaking the all-time record in Nebraska of voter participation in a primary, which was 413,000 ballots cast in 1972. Of that, 415,000 voted early by mail, and 77,000 voted at their polling site on election day. And all 1,225 precincts that we had in the state of Nebraska opened on time and with at least the minimum amount of poll workers, something that this office took a lot of great pride in, that our counties were able to do that when many other states had trouble. So the question that I get asked quite a bit, and why I've been doing a lot of Zoom calls over the last 3 months, especially in other states that had primaries after us, well, how did we do it? So a little bit about the timeline. So again, our primary was on May 12th, 2020, and Nebraska's first case of COVID was on March 1st, 2020. And so over the next 12 days, March 13th, between March 1st and March 13th, you saw a lot of things in Nebraska start to either be postponed, canceled, or moved. For example, we were scheduled to have some of the NCAA tournament games in Omaha canceled. The Berkshire Hathaway annual shareholders meeting canceled. The College World Series canceled. And so we saw a lot of the sports and major events in those first 12 days, and that kind of, dominoed throughout the nation. And then we started to see business shut down and schools canceling, what have you. I always remember March 13th because it was actually my birthday. We were scheduled to go to a fish fry. The fish fry got canceled. So that's when it really got real for me. But starting in March, we started to have discussions internally of what an election would have to look like, whether it be moved or if we had to have it, what could we do to make sure that our election could go on. So later on that next week, there were a couple of primaries that happened in Arizona, but Ohio actually suspended their primary and later on did it exclusively by mail with a future election date. And so that's kind of when we started to see nationwide the March and April elections start to be postponed to later on while people were trying to figure out what was going on with COVID. Well, internally, discussions were had between the Secretary of State's office and the governor's office. And it was kind of unclear who had the authority to actually move an election. It's not something that was contemplated in our election law. And so between all those discussions, it was decided that the election would go on. And then on March 26th, the Secretary of State and the governor held a press conference to talk about, since there were a lot of questions about our primary, to let the citizens know that the primary was going to happen on May 12th and what we were doing to make sure that we were going to keep voters and poll workers safe. So at that press conference, many different announcements were made. We sent an early ballot application to every voter whose county already didn't do so. Approximately of that 1.2 million, our three largest counties had already decided to send early ballot applications. So we just had to handle about 70 to 80 counties after that that didn't have the resources or didn't have the ability to do that. And we were lucky. I made an order with our print shop for 400,000 pieces of paper that we could make applications with because the supply chains were starting to get strained. And so on the same day that I bought that paper, I also secured 500,000 sets of early ballot envelopes for an emergency supply our counties could draw upon because they're used to 25% voting by mail in a primary election. And as we saw, it ended up being closer to 75%. So that emergency supply of envelopes was very important, along with sending that early ballot application. We also purchased a secure ballot drop box for every county that did not have one. Approximately, we bought 51 out of our 93 counties needed a drop box. So we did that in time. So the month before the election, they were able to have a place 24 hours a day to drop off the ballot. And that was important because the one executive order that we had to have was that the decision was made in consultation with our political parties, our ADA community, and our voter advocacy groups that we were going to close the election offices statewide for in-person early voting to help control the spread of the virus. In March, we really didn't know much of what was going on. But we knew if a county election office were to go down, that could disrupt the entire statewide election. So I held a conference call with every major voter advocacy and political party and people that were interested in elections, and it was an agreement based upon everything else we were doing to equal the playing field for everyone statewide that people felt comfortable closing the offices during the early voting period and focus on getting people to vote by mail. We also we're going to do a radio, print, and social media campaign to encourage early voting. And probably one of the bigger things that we did is we procured personal protective equipment for county election offices and polling sites. And these were things that you couldn't find previously. So the one thing that we announced that day is that we secured precinct level hygiene kits for poll workers. And that these kits included hand sanitizer, Clorox wipes, which it was something you really couldn't find at the time, gloves, and N95 masks. And later on, we added to those kits face shields and then masks for voters if they choose to want if they didn't have one, if they could have one available for them at the polling site. In addition, we purchased enough pens that every voter got their own pen. so you didn't have to worry about sharing a pen with another voter. The middle picture is one of the deliveries of pallets of pens to our largest county in Omaha. And then we also provided painter's tape. And why this was important, and we took this from actually the DC Board of Elections, this allowed us to actually mark off on the ground 6 feet social distancing. Again, things that we think are, standard right now, where March we didn't know how to be able to do this, and especially not being able to get supplies, we thought painter's tape was the easiest way that we could mark off the 6 feet of distancing. And so everyone was supplied that tape. So we were very ingenuitive of what we could do to provide supplies that you might not have thought of to be able to comply with all the different guidelines that were coming out of this. So getting those PPE kits helped slow the decay of poll workers not wanting to serve. So that got us to the end of the March, and this was always my favorite meme at the end of March. I've already completed my 90-day trial of 2020. How do I cancel? Well, March, while it was the longest month, we still had 6 weeks to go for the election. So everyone got an early ballot application. Everyone knew about a PPE kit. So what did we do next? We started a campaign to recruit and let folks know that we would protect poll workers. And so the Nebraska Step Up campaign happened, encouraging people that might not have served as a poll worker before to step up to replace those that were of a vulnerable population that wanted to sit out this election. So we have a law in the books that allows for poll workers. A 501c3 can contract with the election office so that all the poll workers can donate their pay to the organization. So one check could be made to the organization rather than just the pay going to each worker. And so since a lot of organizations didn't have the ability to fundraise, this is a great way for your Rotary clubs or your Optimist clubs or civic organizations to be able to donate their time and the money going to the organization. But we knew this wasn't going to be enough, and so we reached out to different organizations to see what we could do to help. First, we went to the lawyers. The Nebraska Bar Association agreed that all lawyers that volunteer to be poll workers would receive a free 1.5-hour CLE course on election law. Our certified public accountants, they came on board as well once they heard the lawyers did as well, and they got credit for those. And so we put out a press release about those two organizations. And lo and behold, the realtors came in. Well, they don't have an education requirement, but they wanted to be known that their folks wanted to volunteer as poll workers as well. And so they did a great social media campaign on election day, letting know that realtors were helping and stepping up. We also, in this age of Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all sorts of social media, we found that the old school way of reaching out to our citizens got the most impact, especially in our rural areas. So we put ads in newspapers statewide, radio ads statewide, encouraging people to early vote as well as be a poll worker. We also, with all the extra paper that we had from our early ballot mailing, we mailed a form to every voter 18 to 50 in the counties that needed a little extra help, and we found that toward the end, this was great leads for folks to fill in folks at the last minute. And, you might not think, maybe 2 or 3 of these came in at the county level, but those 2 or 3 made sure that everyone was able to have a poll site open on election day. We also did traditional social media. This is a YouTube ad that I did that was viewed tens of times, half of which was by my mother because she didn't get to see me for that entire time. But we did find that our old school ways of communicating had some of the greatest impact, especially in rural Nebraska. The final part of our plan was Project DSAUCE, and DSAUCE stands for Deputy Secretary of State. I don't like the nickname DSAUCE. It sounds like what you dip a McNugget in, but that's kind of my nickname for my title, to shorten it down a little bit. And so I work with the National Guard to have 130 members of our National Guard volunteer. They weren't ordered. They volunteered to serve, and they were stationed in 8 different counties as backups statewide. And they could reach any polling site within an hour if needed. And we got PPE to them all as well. And this happened because, we were having a lot of flare-ups in our meat packing plants. For example, we had a large flare-up in one of our counties in which 300 people were diagnosed with COVID in one day. And that was announced the day after the election. If that would have been the day before, we could have had a lot of people scared and not want to show up. And those folks were available to step up, and they were trained as poll workers. We didn't need them, but they stayed in those communities and helped, like you see here, delivering supplies on election day. So that's a little bit about how we did it. And again, this is a chart that I used on election day, a map of Nebraska. And as every county said that their polling sites were open, I did it green. And I posted this on Twitter. I show the post because it was my favorite reply. This is delightfully lo-fi. Yeah, you can't hack paper into Sharpie, I replied. So, a little old school on this piece of paper, but it's something that I'll carry with me as a reminder of how we got through this election. So that's a little bit of all the things that we did to get through the election. So let's recap, and then I want to talk a little bit about the by mail and some things to think about as New York starts to increase the number of people that are voting by mail. So again, 493,000 voted, breaking the record from 1972. And of that, 415,000 voted early by mail. In a normal primary election, that would be 59,000. And that would be approximately, 20 to 25% of the vote. It was interesting to hear how in New York, that'd be 59,000 total for New York in a primary, which just shows how, early voting in New York isn't something that was done a whole lot, but we're seeing now that it is. However, it was very important that polling sites be open on election day, and 77,000 people did vote at their polling site. So going into a little bit about how our laws helped be able to let us scale up this election. Like I said, in a typical election, 75% of ballots are cast at the polling site and taken to the election office after the polls close at 8 p.m., and then they're counted. And even though in the 2020 primary, 75% of those ballots were cast by mail, we were done counting around the same time on election night because we had the capacity to count the ballots regarding of voted method. So for the majority of our counties, the ballots are brought back to the election office and counted by high-speed scanners. And so the early ballots are counted earlier in the day or even the day before. And so really, we were done faster because a low amount of ballots were brought back to the office after 8 p.m. Again, one of the things that not a whole lot of people know is that in this election, we also implemented brand new counting equipment and reporting software statewide. We are an ES&S state. ES&S is one of the largest providers of election and equipment in the nation, and they're based here in Omaha, Nebraska. And we upgraded to the latest counters. So not only did we have to train online and virtually because we couldn't do it in person because of COVID, but we did have the scanning technology available to handle this large amount of ballots and be done, early in the morning on the day after the election. So here's some of the how our existing laws allowed us to scale up, and some things to think about as New York sees more early voting. Voters can request an early ballot 120 days before an election. So starting on July 6th, people could start requesting that ballot for November. The ballots begin to be mailed out 35 days before an election. As we're preparing for the count, ballot envelopes can be opened and ballots put in a locked ballot box to be prepared to be counted 8 days before the election. We're seeing in some states they're not even allowed to open the ballot envelopes until election day. So when we talk about elections not knowing the result, it's because some of the laws in some states aren't very adaptive to large early voting. Ours luckily are, and so all of our ballots are ready to be counted, and they can be counted starting the day before. Most of our counties wouldn't do it the day before. Our largest counties might, but in this election, because of the large early voting, some may start counting the day before. Our ballots must be returned to the election office by the time the polls close, so that's why most of our ballots can be counted, because they can be logged and then counted right after, and most of our ballots are returned before election day. So that's why we have a lot of them ready to go by election morning so they can start to be counted. And again, Nebraska is a central count state, so most of the ballots come back to the election office to be counted. So as I was hearing in your presentation, Rachel's presentation about many of the ballots aren't counted until after the election, the counting machine is already there. they can start earlier in the day, and so that's why our results are available on Election Day. So our election kind of went under the radar in national news. If you're not a dumpster fire, you don't make the lead. So the next day after our election, this was the only national news outlet that said anything about our elections, and ABC News tweeted out, it looks like both elections passed without major incident, and Nebraska was even a notable success. So sometimes no news is good news, but we were very happy that we were able to get it done for our voters. These are some of the pictures we got after Election Day, for the folks that wearing their face shields and masks and thanking us for keeping them safe. And so the county's only asked of one thing of me on Election Day. After everything was done, they wanted to see me in the same PPE. So here I am with a face mask or mask and a shield. I want to thank you for letting me talk about the Nebraska experience, and I look forward to your questions. So thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much. And I think we have a lot to learn from the Nebraska election and a lot of lessons that we can apply to New York, frankly. We have a couple of submitted questions that I'd like to start with. So I get this is for both of you, I guess, in different approaches, but do you predict a change in the breakdown of voter demographics with a move to mail-in voting? And that's for Rachel. And then for Wayne, was this the case in Nebraska? Did you see, more turnout among younger voters or older voters, or was there any discernible breakdown?
I will say in our case, it was a larger turnout, but it was proportional throughout the age demographics. And so it's something that we don't track as much, but it wasn't, there wasn't one typical more than the other. I think what we saw is more people, because of the by mail application, that normally wouldn't vote in a primary, but a general election decided to vote in this primary. So,
I don't think that I that's hyperbole. I think historically in New York, most the people who vote absentee tend to skew older. I don't think that as we were in voting absentee in the age of COVID, that there was any indication. I think it was people of all ages. And in fact, I think as some of the races were decided, as some of the close primaries were decided, weeks after primary night, I think that some of the demographics that people might have assumed of people voting absentee didn't pan out the way that they had assumed.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what shakes out, but that's very interesting to hear. Do you think that we'll keep this option for expanded mail-in voting in future elections, seeing the successes of places like Nebraska and sort of the opportunity that it gives for higher voter turnout?
So I think that once New York State passes no excuse absentee voting, I think we're going to see a rise in people requesting to vote absentee across all groups. And I think one of the things that Wayne said that I found really interesting was how in smaller counties, they vote entirely by mail. I talked about how counties have to cover the cost of elections. I think that we're going to be reevaluating how we run elections and administer elections as a result of this. And I think there will be some counties and I think there might be states across the country who just think, well, it's a lot cheaper to just have mail-in voting. So I think that, like in so many things, it's going to impact us, and we're going to be seeing it come out. But I think that there are hopefully once we have no excuse absentee voting, it's going to be just many more people will be choosing to vote that way, no matter the circumstances.
I think from the Nebraska perspective, what we've been hearing is a lot of folks love their polling site, and so polling sites are not going to go away. And so a lot of folks, like for this election, I'm going to vote by mail, but I want to go back to my polling site when life gets back to normal. The state, my budget won't necessarily we were very fortunate with federal CARES Act money to be able to pay for a mailing like this, but I don't think our state wouldn't be able to afford this mailing had it not been for those federal funds. So when we go back to a sense of normalcy in our elections, our hope is that, you know, we've educated the public that you can get the application from your election office or online and submit it yourself versus having to have one sent to you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I will say I voted by mail for the June primary, and it was not as satisfying as handing in my ballot and getting a
No.
sticker.
No,
So
it is not.
I feel that personally.
Well, we made sure in Nebraska, we told our clerks to put an I voted sticker in the envelope because a lot of people were mad they didn't get their sticker. So we made that happen.
New York has only had stickers statewide for a year, so we're new to that
They
as
were
well.
great. They were great stickers.
I could run a most perfect election, and if a polling site runs out of stickers, you would have thought I would have franchised the entire state. So.
Yeah.
Give the people what they want. Okay, so this next question is someone who actually works New York City polls. So he says, presumably we don't count absentee ballots until election day so that we can eliminate ballots where this is an indication of an in-person vote. How does Nebraska address this potential problem if you start counting beforehand?
Yeah, so when you request an early ballot, your name is actually X'd out in the poll book. And so you're not able to sign the poll book, so you're not going to be able to vote at your polling site. However, there are many instances in which maybe you didn't get your ballot, you forgot, you know, and so people go to their polling site, and you're able to vote provisionally. And so your ballot is put into an envelope, sealed, and put into the ballot box. And then those provisional ballots, those are processed after Election Day. And one of the things is that they make sure that the early ballot that was issued to you did not come back by Election Day at 8 p.m. And if it didn't, then your provisional ballot counts. If it did, then it can be sent to the county attorney for investigation of why you tried to vote twice. Mainly what we find is it's someone elderly that requested a ballot early, voted early, forgot that they did so and went to their polling site because that's what they do on Election Day. So it's not necessarily malfeasance, but that's that check and balance for us to make sure people aren't voting twice.
Great. And then, Rachel, you said in New York, if you count,
I'm sorry. So in New York, I mean, that is part of the process. In New York, it's unusual. One of the few ways that New York has a law that sort of gives more options to the voters than others is that you can request an absentee ballot, and you can even fill it in and mail. You can fill it out and mail it in, and then you can still choose. Let's say something comes up 2 days before the election and you change your mind. You can go to your poll site and vote early or vote in person. I wouldn't recommend that you do that just because I think it makes it much harder for election administrators, but you can absolutely request your absentee ballot and then go vote in person, and no one is X'd out, which is good in New York because so many people never receive their absentee ballots as requested in the primary.
Right, that makes sense. So you have all the options sort of presented to you.
Yeah, it's one of the few ways that New York gives an excess of options that other states do not historically offer.
Well, it's good to know as a New Yorker. And I think we have time for one more question. So not to end on such a controversial note, but why do you both think that mail-in voting has become a partisan issue lately?
I mean, elections, look, in an ideal world, elections wouldn't be partisan, but and they shouldn't be administered partisanly. But I mean, you are voting, and you know that's exactly what an election is. I don't know. You know, I will say this, that for all of the talk about voter fraud, for all of the talk about people stealing elections, if you look at the data, that has never come out to play. Voter fraud is basically non-existent in this country. And the president himself votes absentee. He votes by mail. And so, you know, in New York, everyone is voting absentee. I will say no one is voting by mail. You actually have to request your ballot. So why is it partisan? Because we live in partisan times. But are you know, ensuring that everyone can cast a ballot and that it's counted should not be a partisan thing. And voter fraud is a myth. That is what I will end with. Voter fraud is a myth, and it is found to be, it is found in such small numbers as to basically be mathematically not even worth discussing.
I guess what I'll say is I think in many parts of the United States, election laws are being changed on a dime. And change can be hard and it can be scary when you're not used to, Rachel mentioned New Jersey. They had polling sites. Now everyone's being mailed a ballot. Even the state of Washington that votes completely by mail says it's not something you easily flip a switch. It took 6 to 8 years for Washington to completely get to that point. So I think that for a lot of Americans, the change and all the differences is scary, and they maybe not all of them were done in a legislative law fashion. They were done by executive orders or what have you, so that it just needs to be explained to them, and so they need consistency. They need just guidance that they know that their vote's going to count. We were lucky that I only needed 2 executive orders this entire election. One to close down the offices to control the spread, and one, it was just to allow the poll workers didn't have to be a resident of the county, so I could get the National Guard folks in, even though they were Nebraska residents. So we were very lucky we didn't have to change a whole lot of laws. I didn't get sued, knock, knock, knock on wood so far on one of those.
Wow, very impressive.
I haven't yet. I have 5 lawsuits for initiative petitions right now, but that happens all the time. So I guess what I want to leave on, election administrators are working their tails off. So take the politics out of the administration. That your local board of election, your election official, your poll workers, thank them for their work, and let the campaigns be the campaigns. But your election administrators are hard at work. Many behind your desk. I haven't worked from home a day since all this started to make sure that your vote happens. So roll with the punches, but thank your poll worker on election day.
Yeah, and I just want to say, changing the way you vote, it takes time. Bills get passed and then they have several years of implementation usually. And what, Wayne just said about, if we were to switch to a vote by mail, it's a sort of process that would take years to implement. We don't change the way we administer elections, and we don't change the way we administer presidential elections, in a matter of months. So I just, I really second what Wayne said as an advocate and someone who is often critical of people administering our elections. They are working under enormously difficult circumstances with a lot on them. And people say, well, why don't we just do this? Why don't we just do that? Hopefully I made it clear that it's not that simple in New York. You can't just decide to do this and do it. There are laws, there are processes, there's approvals. But yeah, we are operating, these are not normal times, and everything is just more complicated than as a voter you think it is. I think there's so many things behind the scenes that a voter just is unaware of. So.
And I'll close this by saying, just think about, as you are changing your laws, how that impacts the administration and the results. As an example, I give Michigan. By proposition, they have no excuse early voting now. What they didn't think about is you can't open the ballots until election day. So what happens is you have thousands upon thousands of ballots in Michigan that can't even be opened and taken out of the envelope until election day. And so that's going to extend the amount of time before results in Michigan. So while some laws you think are great, think about the impact on the administration of your local board of elections to make sure that all those kinks are ironed out.
Absolutely. And I think we'll end on that note. And I just really want to thank you both so much for taking the time. As you both mentioned, it's so important to be educated around this issue. It affects all of us. Sign up to be a poll worker, thank your poll worker, and vote. Everyone should go out there and vote. So thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great day.